Nice. Thank you, Paulette. And let's see, am I able to share? Yes, hopefully I'll be able to. Paulette, thank you. Okay, well, for all of you who are right on time and early, it is good to see some of you and see the names of the rest of you, but that's fine. I understand that people probably have other things going on, which is absolutely okay. And what we're going to do today, first of all, I hope everybody had a good week. I hope you're feeling well. It looks like we have more people coming in even as we speak. But what we're going to do today is we're going to continue from where we left off. If you remember last week, for those of you who were with us, we traveled in the footsteps of the early Zionists, and we met Lydia, and we really bounced around the country from Jaffa and Tel Aviv to the north, Zichron Yaakov and the Kinneret Cemetery. We really covered a lot of ground last week. Today's going to be a little bit different. We're not necessarily going to follow a particular theme throughout the entirety of the country, but we are going to follow a particular theme as far as a region is concerned. And today, oh, we got a lot of people coming through the door, which is great. Today, we're going to be traveling throughout the Golan Heights. That's going to be our region for today.
Oh,
And hopefully you brought your bathing suits because we're going to need them today when we go to the Golan. And what I will do now is I'm going to share my screen and we will be off and away. And if I know that Paulette is there behind the scenes, but if anything happens and I freeze out or people can't hear me, then Paulette, I don't know if you have my email. Hopefully you do. And if not, from Rabbi Boxman, you can get it and just shoot me a quick note that I've frozen or something. But hopefully that will be all fine. And we will set out on our journey. Sound good? All right. Here we go. Let's do this. Get rid of that. Say hello to the mishpacha here, to the family.
oh, there you are.
And here we go. We're going to pick up our bus. It must be around here somewhere in front of our congregation here. I don't see it, but maybe he's just running a little late. Instead, we're just going to fly away and make our way all the way to Israel. Whoops. That's weird. Okay, there we go. All right. So as you can see, we're in the northern part of Israel. Let me zoom out for just a moment here. And as I zoom out, it becomes more clear, the entire region, of course. And we'll be talking more about Syria over here and referencing Lebanon as well. You can see where we are. You can actually see very nicely this notion of the Fertile Crescent. That's where we are. The Fertile Crescent was this area from Mesopotamia all the way down towards east. We follow our biblical narrative took when they left from Ur Kasdim, which was Babylon, Mesopotamia back then, and made their way towards the land of Canaan. You can see how this really is a land bridge between civilizations, between the area of the Tigris and the Euphrates, where 5,000 years before the Common Era, we begin to see the establishment of that civilization around the outlets of those rivers, and Cairo, of course, with the Nile. So, and we were right there in the middle. So it makes sense that this would be a meeting ground of different ideas, different kinds of people, and we all have our own understanding of what the Bible is, as far as it's given by God to Moses at Mount Sinai, or written by human beings, but we understand that it's a story which makes sense, that this meeting place is where new beginnings would happen, including new faiths and new religions. So there is a lot to say about its geographic location vis-a-vis the evolution of the faith and faiths ultimately, but Jewish faith that evolved there. But obviously that's not what we're here to discuss today. In fact, we're going to zoom on back down. Let me just move over a little bit here. Move the screen over and we'll zoom in back to our view of the northern part of Israel. Here we have Haifa over here and Nazareth in the lower Galilee. Nahariya is a city in the western Galilee, right on the corner, right on the Mediterranean Sea. We see the city of Tiberias, and just northeast of the Sea of Galilee over here, the Kinneret in Hebrew, is the Golan Heights. And you can see I've outlined the Golan here. It's about 70 kilometers in length, about 30 kilometers, 35 kilometers in width. Just to remind us, 1.6 kilometers for every mile. We will have a chance to talk more about the geography and the fact that it's a raised plateau at about 1,000 meters, even 200 meters at its highest peak. Or we'll talk about the tallest mountain in Israel, which is Mount Hermon, which is at the northern part of the Golan Heights. We'll see it more clearly. Let me zoom in a little bit. You can even see a little bit of the white here in the snow. Mount Hermon, which is 2,200 meters above sea level, our only ski mountain. There's actually 3 peaks to Mount Hermon. One peak is in Syria, one peak is in Lebanon, and one peak is in Israel. It's such a small place, even mountains we have to share. But before we continue talking about the Golan, I actually want to zoom on down to an area north of the Sea of Galilee, which extends all the way to our border with Lebanon, and that is called the Hula Valley. So we're going to start over there. And I didn't say this before, but I'll remind you that we're going to be together for about 75 minutes or so as we explore and try and peel back all of those layers. Now I'm going to zoom out just a tad here. And I mentioned the Hula Valley. The Hula Valley itself is about, you can see here is the Sea of Galilee that I mentioned before. This is that Hula Valley. And as you ascend from the lowest freshwater lake in the world, which is about 200 meters below sea level, you reach this valley, which is about 30 kilometers long and about 7 or 8 kilometers wide, which is a breadbasket of the state of Israel. It's called the Hula Valley, and it sits about 70 meters above sea level. So we've really done quite a climb to get here. The earliest human settlement that was discovered in this valley goes back 9 or 10,000 years. The first Jewish settlement in modern times is in 1883, a settlement that was part of those first wave of immigration. We spoke about that last week when we talked about Zichron Yaakov, for example. That settlement was called Yesod HaMa'ala, and they settled right smack dab in the middle of the Hula Valley. When they arrived, in fact, there was a lake in the Hula Valley and a series of swamps. It would be those swamps that Israel took upon itself from its founding in 1948 and even before, but really in full thrust, to eradicate. Now, I don't know if any of you remember back in the 1950s, let's say, if you were in religious school at the time, you remember maybe putting money in a J&F box. That money was used to, yes, to plant trees, and yes, to create settlements like kibbutzim, but also to drain the Hula Valley. Within the first decade, almost a little bit more, the first decade of the founding of the state, Israel's largest infrastructural endeavor was to drain the Hula Valley and turn it into that breadbasket that we spoke of. And they succeed. Now, interesting enough, if you ask me, they also, at the same time, completely annihilate, at least briefly, an ecosystem. What do I mean? I mean, the moment we dried up all the swampland, the stopover point of 500 million birds that travel through the Hula Valley twice a year as they travel and traverse what is called the Syrian African Rift, which runs all the way from Turkey down to Mozambique in Africa, about 6,000 kilometers in length, was the reason we have these bodies of water. When millions and millions of years ago, the entire area, had its tectonic plates shift like this. And if you can look in the window there, shift and broke away. And the bottom dropped out. And the Tethys Sea that was around 100 million years ago begins to dissipate. And we end up with the Red Sea in the south, the Mediterranean Sea in the west, the Dead Sea, the Sea of Galilee, the Hula Lake. And slowly but surely, as the land begins to solidify itself, we end up with this Rift Valley, which again is very deep. It has the Dead Sea, etc., and so on. But it's going to be along this Rift Valley that is one of the main migratory routes of the migrating birds. Now, by the way, is the perfect time if there's any birders amongst you. Just recently, there was hundreds of thousands of pelicans. It's really amazing. What we're going to do, however, before we climb up onto the Golan Heights, we're actually going to stop at the foot of the Golan Heights and meet a friend of mine, a guy named Eitan, who's going to share a little bit about his life as we join him in his agricultural work, because Eitan's a farmer. So let's zoom on down. And you're going to see that we're going to hover right there. You know what? Let me go back just a tad. Let me go back one so that we can actually get to Eitan's field. There we go. And we're going to get off the bus somewhere around here. We're just going to drive over and we'll get off in his field. We'll be with Eitan for about 7 minutes or so. You can see the Golan Heights over there. We're now in the Hula Valley, right at the foot of the Golan. Eitan, how are you?
Hi, Shalom. This is my friend Eitan Bloomberg. So Eitan, before we go into the field, where are we?
Okay, so welcome to the Hula Valley. Once upon a time, back in the early 1950s, this was basically a swamp. We are in a swamp. By the way, this last winter, these whole fields were covered basically almost a meter high with water, as we had a very, very good winter. Not so good for farming, good for water. But basically this was the Hula Lake or the Hula swamp. And today these are fields of a kibbutz called Ma'ayan Baruch. Basically the whole Hula Valley is divided to little plots and divided between the kibbutzim in the area. This specific field, we grew beans on it, and we are preparing it towards the autumn and winter. The Golan Heights on one side, the Upper Galilee behind on the other side, and that is where we are. We're sitting in a John Deere tractor. These are the bigger tractors we have. Once I'm in the line, I've operated the autopilot, if you wish. You see here on the screen. Right now the autopilot is on. Basically, you can see the tractor, and is where the blue is covered. I have already the COVID-19 virus dropped me back 30 years back into an earlier career that I had, in farming. Something that I always really missed, how things work out. Good music, good company, good view, birds all over the place. From the watering pipe all the way to the end, it will take me 2 days. And now what we're doing is preparing it for a next seeding, which will probably... it's not yet decided, there are all kinds of things, market and price and water and how long the crop needs because it has to be harvested before the rains, or maybe perhaps during winter. So all kinds of decisions which are done by the growers, perhaps parsley or cabbage, any other stuff, or preparing it perhaps for winter crops like winter wheat. Basically here in the Hula Valley we grow wheat and potatoes and corn, both for the cow industry and for sweet corn, tomatoes for industry. It's now the season of harvesting the tomatoes, and parsley, cabbage. It used to be cotton, not anymore, because of due to price of water on one side and price of the cotton itself on the other side. and a big basket of
And you
cloth. You can see peanut, we see plums over there in orchard, or plums, a lot of almonds. Almonds is very big and growing all the time. These are bees that are used for pollination. And if I'm going off for a moment, I will open up and zoom out. Behind us is the Golan Heights. And, you know, when we talk about Israel and the Hula Valley, going back between 1948, the independence of Israel, in 1967, Six-Day War, a tractor like this that was working here in this specific field was basically under fire as the Syrians sat right on the cliff above us. So strategically, they had a great advantage over the valley. So the tractors didn't look like this, of course. They were covered with shields. And the farmer that went out in the morning to the field could not know if specifically that day would be quiet or maybe he would be shot at any time. This spot was still Israel, as the border was at the foothills.
What did the COVID-19 do to your profession that caused you to go back to your roots?
So I was a tour guide. Actually, you know, now talking to you, for me as an Israeli, I'm not an English-speaking person at home. We speak Hebrew, so right now I'm enjoying practicing. So if my English sounds not smooth, it's because mostly in the last 5 months I've been talking Hebrew. So it's a good option and a moment for me to get my tongue rolling again. But basically, I'm a tour guide. I'm not saying I was a tour guide.
That's right.
I still am a tour guide. And once we were struck by the virus, and it didn't take me a long time to understand that it's here for quite a while. And as my calendar was getting cleaned up, job after job, as 2020 was really beautifully booked, and I want to be proactive. This is my character always, and I chose to look around. And I searched my CV in my brain and said, okay, what can I do? What do I know to do? What do I have the experience and the capability? Where do I live also? The fact that I live here in the periphery and not in Tel Aviv gave me the option to come and work in farming. So I started to look around, and as the virus broke out in the end of winter, March, beginning of summer, it was right high peak season, and I was lucky, and I found a job here in farming. But yeah, I put aside tourism for a moment. Hoping to come back as soon as the skies open and tourists will return. This is not as good as what I did before, but it's good enough for me right now. And I'm happy, and I have my stability, and
So, you know, full disclosure, Eitan and I know each other for many years. We've been colleagues for many, many years working in the field together. Not these fields, but the fields of tour education. And not to get too philosophical, but you mentioned the Golan Heights, and you mentioned the farmers that went out, and they did what they needed to do. And essentially, I said, I guess that's what the world is trying to do, and that's what we're trying to do in our little micro version of what's happening in the macro out there. We do what we need to do. And if you can do it in an area that you enjoy, and that you're with the land still, maybe in a different way you're with the land. But I think that's amazing. But you grew up in this area? Is this where you were born and raised?
No. I was born in Jerusalem.
Ah, okay.
And I came to the Galil much later after my marriage. And I've been living in the Galil for 25 years now. And sometime a little bit in Metula, 23 years already at this house in Mishmar HaYarden. And I'm happy.
So one of the ideas of these tours that we do, whether it was last week or this week, is really not just to see the sights, but to also get to know some Israelis and the different kinds of Israelis that are out there. We still have a person or two that we're going to meet today. What I'd like to do, however, is show you where we're going to leave Eitan's field behind, the Hula Valley behind. I just want to zoom up a little bit so we can see where we're going to go. We can see that this is that line delineating between the Hula Valley down below, and you can even see how much it's become a breadbasket of the country, and the slopes of the Golan Heights. We'll have a chance to talk more about this, but I did mention before that we're looking at 70 kilometers or so in length, 35 kilometers in width. It's about 1,150 square kilometers, the entirety of the Golan, and the Hula Valley down below is pales in comparison. It's only about 177 square kilometers. In general, we don't have a lot of land in Israel. The entire area is one big volcanic eruption. There was, as part of those shifting tectonic plates, and we'll actually be on some volcanoes a little bit later today. What I would like to do before I talk any more about the Golan, you can take a look here and you can see this valley. We're going to be walking along. We're going to go on a hike now. And it's called the Gila Boone River. It's about 16 kilometers long. We won't do the entirety. That might be a bit of a schlep, even for me down in the field. But I do believe we have a guide waiting for us. And what we're going to do is we're going to get on a bus near Eitan's field, and we're going to cross over the Jordan River. And when we cross over the Jordan River, you'll see the bus seems to slow down because I didn't want you to miss the Jordan River. Regardless of what the song says, the Jordan River is not deep nor wide. And if you blink, it's gone. So I slowed the bus down a little bit so you could see it. And then we will ascend, once we cross over the river, we'll ascend up onto the Golan, and that's where we're going to meet our guide. So we're still on the Hula Valley side of the Jordan River. In a moment, though, we'll cross over and then begin to ascend up onto the Golan. And I'd love to say that there's some great white water rafting on the Jordan, but that's not entirely accurate. It's more like mother of pearl.
So there's lots of wonderful things to do in the Golan Heights. We can meet interesting people. We can see ancient archaeological sites. We can see incredible views and vistas. We can see into other countries and talk about the geopolitics. We can talk about the different kinds of Israelis that are living up here in the Golan. And we can see beautiful nature. And that's what we're going to do. We're going to check out one of the most incredible waterfalls that are here in the state of Israel, called the Gila Boone Waterfalls. It's going to be amazing.
In a moment, you'll look out, you can see the Hula Valley to the west of us. That's Eitan's field. In a moment, we're going to go all the way down to the bottom of that waterfall. So just watch your step here. The rocks, it's all the dark gray rocks that you see, it's all basalt. It's all from those volcanic eruptions. It can get a little tricky though, trying to cross the water. We'll go there.
Now I know the pool is around here somewhere. You just have to follow the waterfall.
That's my daughter, Adi. She was my camera woman for the day.
All right, I have a good feeling about this. We're almost there. Oh yeah, nice. Okay, it's a hot day. I think we owe it to ourselves, or at least to me, to check out the water. Really cool. I'm gonna check it out. Amazing. Check out the view. So we started to make our way up out of the valley. That was pretty refreshing. And we still have a little bit of a ways to go as we make our way up the rest of the trail, all the way up and out of the ravine. But well worth it.
It was, in fact, well worth it, I have to tell you. Not too shabby. It's a hard job, but somebody's got to do it. What we're going to do, however, now is we're going to fly up and over out of the valley, if it's okay with you. So we're actually going to now zoom on down. The Golan Heights has about 25,000, 27,000, give or take, Jews who live here in the Golan. And there's about 20,000 Druze, D-R-U-Z-E. We'll meet the Druze a little bit later today. Those Israeli citizens who live in the Golan live in either kibbutzim or moshavim, those agricultural communal settlements, or Druze villages, or they live in the one city that's here in the Golan, and that is the city of Katsrin. And in a moment, we're going to zoom on down to the ancient part of Katsrin. But I'll let you know, if I mention the Hula Valley, the first residence settlement that was discovered was from almost 10,000 years ago. We know from our own biblical narrative that two of the tribes were given parts of this area. There was the tribe of Dan, a little bit further north. They actually weren't given that area. They rather took that area. An interesting story, but maybe one for another day. And the half tribe of Menashe. Any and all players that play out in the Bible controlled this area, whether it was the early Israelites or the Assyrians or the Babylonians or the Persians or the Greeks or the Hasmoneans or the Romans. In fact, there's a city here in the Golan called Gamla, a little bit further south from where we are. And Gamla was a Jewish city in the days of the Second Temple period that has a very interesting story, not that dissimilar to Masada. Again, also a very powerful story, but one for another day, because today what I would like to do is we're going to zoom on down into the city of Katsrin. We're going to get off of the bus at the visitor center here. Let me just spin around here. Let me see. Where is that entrance? Oh, there it is, right through here. If anyone needs the restroom, by the way, when we go through the entrance, to the right is where the restrooms are. And I believe that our guide is waiting for us just on the inside. Why don't we hop over and see him? Okay, very nice. As you can see, there's a lot of ruins over here. This was a Jewish village that goes back about 1800 years, 1700 years. What it provides for us is proof of Jewish existence. Now, just to remind you of what's going on 1800 years ago, we're about 200 years after the Second Temple is destroyed, maybe 150 years after we rebelled against Rome. We're shortly after a second rebellion against Rome called the Bar Kokhba Rebellion. And yet there's a thriving Jewish community that continues living here in the Golan Heights. There's a central building that really is the pinnacle of this Jewish village. But you know what? I don't want to steal the thunder of our guide. I know he's around here somewhere. Let's see if we can't find him. Oh, there he is.
We know that in biblical times, both from the book of Deuteronomy, the book of Joshua, we know that the Golan was a city of refuge in an area identified as the Bashan. And the Bashan is, in fact, the Golan. Jewish life here in the Golan goes back thousands of years. What we have here is an incredible example of Jewish life during the Mishnaic into the Talmudic period, which takes us from the late Roman period into the Byzantine period, and even overlapping with the beginning of the early Arab conquest here in the land of Israel. This particular space is in an area known as Katsrin. Katsrin's a modern city today located in the Golan Heights, but it sits adjacent to and owes its name to the ancient Jewish village of Katsrin. The ancient city of Katsrin was discovered, archaeologically speaking, after the Six-Day War. By 1968, Shmaryahu Gutman and other archaeologists uncovered the buildings that we can see behind me, and ultimately identified that in this particular area, most likely you're looking at a community that was living here from the late 2nd century to the Common Era. So after the destruction of the Second Temple, after the Bar Kokhba Rebellion, we find Jews who are moving around the land and ultimately are going to end up here in the Golan Heights. They will continuously live here all the way into the year 749 to the Common Era, because there was a terrible earthquake that rocked the entire land and ultimately brought this particular Jewish community to an end. According to archaeologists, in its heyday, we're looking at about 300 souls who lived here, about 75, 85 families who lived here, and the finds were incredible. In addition to residential areas, we know of certain rabbis from the Talmudic period that are mentioned. We know of wine press and an olive press. There was a major industry that was here. Really incredible finds that prove that Jews were living here back almost 2,000 years here in the Golan Heights. Now, if that wasn't enough, the height of a Jewish community was, of course, the synagogue, the Beit Knesset. And what was found here is one of the most magnificent synagogues from this period anywhere in Israel. So in a moment, we're about to go inside this incredible synagogue. Now, if you take a look, you can see over the entryway, we have the beautiful leaves, pomegranates, and jugs on either side adorning the entryway to the synagogue. Before we even enter into this incredible building, take a look. You can see that the building itself is made from the basalt stone that we have. In addition, most likely there were also limestone additions to really make sure this building stood out. But let's go inside and check it out. Standing inside this particular synagogue, well, it throws us back to an era in which Jewish life was thriving. We're not talking about the modern state of Israel. We're talking about 1,800 years ago, 1,700 years ago. Now, if you look around, you can see the 4 rows of pillars divided the building into 3 different parts. At its heyday, there was probably a 2nd story as well, with windows up along the edges. Today, we only see the 1 floor over here. And the truth is that there was probably 2, maybe even 3 different synagogues, one on top of each other. The earliest one from the 4th century to the Common Era, to the best of the ability of the archaeologists to understand. And the last synagogue that stood here that was in active use was from the 6th century to the Common Era. So we're talking about a period of time in which the Jews who were living up here would have just recently received the Mishnah that was sealed and delivered in the city of Tzipori in the Lower Galilee by Rabbi Judah the Prince, Yudah Nasi. And it would have been before a time where the Talmud had been sealed, that oral law written down, so that you're talking about progress. You're talking about a process of developing Jewish identity. And this is a perfect example of the vibrancy of Jewish life. On the southern side of the synagogue, this southern side is the direction towards Jerusalem. Remember, we're in the Golan Heights. South is towards Jerusalem. This is where the bima would have been. And they discovered a niche behind the bima that actually served most likely as a gniza, where old sacred texts that could no longer be used would have been placed, a burial of sorts. This synagogue, destroyed, as I mentioned, in the 8th century in that incredible earthquake that, well, literally rocked the country to its core, later in the 13th century would serve as a mosque during the Mamluk period in the northern part of the synagogue, and ultimately would stay, well, silent until today. People will come here, not only people who travel throughout Israel to experience it, but there are celebrations which take place here. And that is quite an incredible thing if you think about it. B'nai mitzvah ceremonies, bar mitzvah, bat mitzvah, moments where Jews can come together and celebrate, where Jewish voices were heard 1,700 years ago.
So what's always so powerful for me to think about is when I to be in a spot like Katsrin, and there's multiple places like this around the country from the Byzantine period, but even from the Roman period, there's a handful of synagogues that are still standing from before when the Second Temple was destroyed. Actually, down the block from where I live here in the city of Modi'in, there is what has been identified as a bona fide synagogue, including a mikveh, spiritual cleansing bath, from the days of the Hasmoneans, who are those Maccabees, of course, that led the rebellion, all the way through the Roman period and even the Bar Kokhba rebellion. So to be in places like here in Katsrin, or in the synagogue down the block from me, and to imagine, you talk about if these walls could speak, what would they have seen? I think what they would say is, especially the one here in Katsrin, they see vibrancy. They see transformation of a people as they evolve. In fact, if you ask me, Judaism has always been a Reform Judaism, maybe not with a capital R, but definitely with a lowercase r, one that has adapted itself from time and time again. And this particular community is an example of that. But you know what? We really have been pushing ourselves pretty hard. I think it's time for us to relax a little bit. I don't know why this keeps popping up. It's time for us to relax just a little bit. And we've hopped just down the road, probably about a 15-minute drive, maybe 20, but not even, from where we were, just north of where we are. Let me zoom out just a little bit so you can see. We are hovering just over a kibbutz called Ein Zivan. And kibbutz Ein Zivan, as you can see, is really just a hop skip from the border, just maybe 2 kilometers at that, to the Syrian border. You can see where we were at the Gila Boone Waterfall, and Katsrin is just to the south of us, just over here. Now, what we're going to do, however, is make our way down onto the kibbutz, and we're not going to do a tour of the kibbutz like we did with Lydia. In fact, Ein Zivan is a different kind of kibbutz than Mishmar HaEmek is, in that Ein Zivan was, I think, the first kibbutz that was established on the Golan Heights post-1967. It was actually founded by soldiers who fought in this area and decided to establish a kibbutz there. Ein Zivan in 1968 is founded. However, it's also going to be one of the first kibbutzim to go through the process of privatization. And I believe already by the early 90s was in the midst of that process. In fact, and we heard a little bit about this last week from Lydia, that the range of kibbutzim, 270 something kibbutzim that are in Israel, is a spectrum of those kibbutzim which are still traditional, work as much as you can, receive as much as you need. And on the far end, on the other direction, to balance the scale, nothing more and nothing less than a gated community. Most are somewhere along that spectrum. Such is Ein Zivan. Now, it still has within it traditional infrastructure, that it has fields of apples and cherries and peaches and pears and nectarines. It has vineyards associated with two main wineries on the kibbutz. And it has where we're going as we get off of our bus here on the kibbutz to one of my family's most favorite places. And we're going to get off our buses, which are right over there. We'll spin around. Here's one of the wineries, Bahat. The other winery, by the way, is called Pelter. It's just on the other side of the building here. But we're going to go right over here to this building, which really is a delicious stop.
So we are on Kibbutz Ein Zivan, one of the kibbutzim up here in the Golan Heights, and we're stopping in one of my favorite places, definitely my daughter's favorite place. It's called De Karina. Let's go check it out. All right, we're inside. Got to put the mask on. If you could smell what I'm smelling, you would know exactly where we've arrived. We've arrived at one of the most delicious chocolate factories in all of Israel. And over here is Katya, who has taken some time from her busy day. And actually, there are Israelis who are traveling around the country, less tourists from outside of Israel, but yes, Israelis. So I've grabbed her for a few moments to give us a little bit of insight of what is this place, De Karina.
So welcome to De Karina, our lovely small boutique chocolate factory. De Karina in Spanish means something that belongs to Karina, which means that Karina is our chocolatier as well. She's a third generation of a family of chocolatiers. She came all the way from Argentina, from Buenos Aires. She moved here into Israel in 2002 and built a factory with her husband 4 years later, and then they started the business. She came here with a big dream to keep her family business going, and that's why she's chosen this place and this kibbutz in the Golan Heights to open a boutique factory. Everything we have in here is handmade, literally everything. We barely have machines. The only machines we have are like tempering machines, which are the ones that mold the chocolate. And we have over 7 workers that works with everything from the producing the chocolate to wrapping it.
So let me just ask you a question then. You said that Karina came here and she opened up a chocolate factory. You mean she didn't go to be a farmer in the fields?
No, she's chosen a chocolate factory because she says, like when she talks about the history of the family, it smelled like chocolate in their house in Argentina because her father and her grandfather were chocolatiers before. So she's a third generation of a family of chocolatiers. Just like, keeping the spark going.
Does she live on the kibbutz still?
She lives in here, yeah.
And where do you live, Katya?
I live in Majdal Shams, actually.
In Majdal Shams.
Yeah.
Oh, so what is your background?
Druze.
And how long have you been working here at Karina's?
I've started working here in 2018, and I worked for a year and a half, and then I left at January, and then I came back this month. Almost 2 years in this place.
Nice. And you go back and forth from Majdal Shams, which is in the northern part of the Golan.
It is like the northest.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay, great. And so what kind of chocolate do we have over here?
Whatever you desire.
If you had to choose one that is most identified with Karina of your chocolates.
I'll go for Mount Hermon for sure, because it has dulce de leche inside, which is milk caramel, and this is something that she actually brought home from Argentina with her, because you know what dulce de leche is.
Sure.
For Argentina. So, and it's like the most special Berlin, as you can see, because Mount Hermon is the highest Hermon here in Israel, and it's here in the Golan Heights. I live exactly over here, and it is really, really delicious. Like it explodes in your mouth.
So these are all really good, but truthfully, I love what you guys do with your frozen drinks, and I actually, excuse me for just a second, because this is I think this is a vanilla shake.
Yeah.
Okay, you'll excuse me for just a moment. Oh man, that's good. That's good. This actually belongs to my daughter Adi, who's behind the camera, and she's giving me a dirty look. So I'm just going to put this right down over here, and that will be hers. All good. Excellent. Well, this is great. So what are some of the other special ones that you have over here? Let's see.
I can also recommend the chili pepper that we have.
Oh,
It's not that chili actually, but the aftertaste is like, you know, a bit spicy. I'd go for the espresso in the parv section. It's really good like quality. It's 70% dark chocolate, none dairy, none sugar almost. It's so good.
It really was good, in fact, and I have to say it is a fun stop. And if you come with your families, you can go and they actually have, you can walk to and tour the factory as they're making the chocolate, and then they have different activities. They do this in various places, but it is a fun stop. Now that we've been rejuvenated, so to speak, what I'd like to do is add yet another layer to what the Golan Heights offers. We looked at the beautiful nature and the antiquity, and of course the vibrant life which is on the Golan and the kibbutz, and the sweetness of the chocolate, and the fact that this immigrant who comes from Argentina, and you think, oh, she's living on a kibbutz and so on, and go work in the field. No, and she opens up her factory. Now, what is so powerful about this, I think it's something that takes new immigrants a very long time usually to discern. And I think this was true in the United States. It definitely was true in Israel and all the waves of immigration, that while we were open-armed, embraced those immigrants who came, it was always, you need to be like us in order to be a true Israeli. But I think as we move forward in time, we recognize that we are in fact the sum total of all of our parts, and that includes our own personal heritage. Yes, we're all Jewish, and we all come to the land of Israel and the state of Israel, but we each bring something with us. Our family may be somewhere else, and therefore I can incorporate that into my own Israeli identity, and clearly Karina was able to do that. What we're going to do, and when I'm zooming out for a moment, this is where Ein Zivan is, and we just hopped up the hill. We climbed up a dormant volcano. Now, the entirety of the Golan Heights, I mentioned already, is a raised plateau. We're looking at averages of 600 meters to 1,000 meters. Soon we're going to climb even higher than that to the peak of this dormant volcano. And it will give us a very powerful overview of Syria and the outside area. So why don't we zoom on down so we can get off of the bus in the parking area. It should be clearing up on your screen right now. You can see the bus has dropped us off right over here. But what we're going to do, you can see we're actually looking down into the mouth of the volcano over here. You actually have a beautiful view of the expanse of the Golan Heights. We're now looking east, and these mountains you see in the distance, we're looking west, and we're looking towards the Galilee, the upper Galilee. If you can see this mist or this haze over here, it's like a foggy area. That is just above the Hula Valley where we were before. So we're looking at the expanse, the width of the Golan over here. Now we're looking south, and you can even see a few more of these dormant volcanoes. But what we're going to do is we're going to actually make our way up this path and see if we can find a view that allows us a geopolitical understanding of what's happening to our neighbor to the east of us. So we just walked up the path from over here. There's a nice little coffee shop if anybody needs to get themselves a drink or hot chocolate. Again, now we're looking west again, so we can see the expanse, the width of the Golan Heights as we look out towards the Galilee. But what I would like to do is spin around. You can see actually that we're on a series of bunkers and trenches. This was actually a military outpost, an Israeli military outpost post-1967. We will be speaking more about the Six-Day War, up until which everything we've been seeing was part of Syria. But after the Six-Day War, this became an outpost for Israeli soldiers so that we could look deep into Syria and prepare ourselves, not to mention use it as an intelligence gathering base. It no longer serves as a military base. There's other bases like it. This has now been open to the public to allow us those vantage points. And I believe as we stand here overlooking these kibbutz fields all the way up to the Syrian border, that our guide is around here somewhere, and he wants to share a few things with us. You will notice that this guide likes to use maps. So if the map stays on your screen a little bit longer than you think it should, it's okay, because he wants you to really have a chance to internalize where everything is. You can see the distance to Damascus is less than 70 kilometers.
Just to give you a sense of where we are, if this is the Golan Heights and the Hula Valley is down below, the Sea of Galilee is over here. Dekarina, where we were, is just about where this S is, and right now we are as pretty much far east as you can go in the state of Israel, on the eastern side of the Golan Heights. Mount Hermon is to the north. Now, all of the green that you see down below, those are all fields connected to kibbutzim that are up here in the Golan Heights. However, if you go just a little bit further on, you can see the coloring start to change, and essentially that's where the border is. Looking at the border in the distance is, in fact, very interesting, and it's not often that you can look deep into another country, as we are right now from Mount Bental looking deep into Syria. Damascus is about 60 kilometers or so in that direction. But ultimately, the power of this overview is not just to look into a separate country, but to understand a little bit about the geopolitical reality, the security situation, and the challenges that Israel faces. But it's also about the challenges that Syria faces. Since March of 2011, Syria has been going through what ultimately has become a world war and a human disaster on historic proportions. What begins in a small village south of where we are in the southern part of the Syrian Golan Heights, a village called Daraa, grassroots rebellion, villagers in the streets protesting Bashar al-Assad. None of this had to do with Israel. It had to do with water. It had to do with misappropriation of funds. It had to do with the fact that the Sunni majority are continuously being downtrodden by the Shiite elite, and it had nothing to do with Israel. There were the military forces that were sent in. It was crushed, and it spread like wildfire throughout Syria. Ultimately, that grassroots rebellion turned into a civil war. It turned into a world war when Iran moves its own troops into Syria to support Bashar al-Assad, not to be outdone by the Shiites. The Sunnis are going to bring in reinforcements, and they bring in folks like Al-Qaeda, a Sunni terrorist organization. Again, not to be outdone, Bashar al-Assad, with the help, of course, in the direction of Iran, are going to bring in Hezbollah. In the entire mix, we also have the Islamic State, not to mention superpowers like Moscow and Russia, or Washington and the United States. And if you really wanted to confuse yourself, try and understand who the bravest of the brave are in that whole mess, and those are the Kurds. Now, to try and get into the entire mess of what is happening over there, we would have to really internalize the fact that since the rebellion begins in March of 2011, at a time when Syria was about 22 million people, today, 50% of the population of Syria are refugees. About 5 million externally, 6 million internally, not to mention more than 500,000 people who have died in this conflict. If we can internalize that, we begin to understand terror that has been happening across the border. Whether or not the forces of Assad have won this war or not, this is a longer conversation. But it is important to recognize that across the way is a linchpin within the overall plan of Iran to solidify for themselves their place at the top of the ladder within the Muslim world. And if Syria were to fall, it would clearly affect Iran in a way that would cause many domino pieces to fall. Now, one of the challenges that Israel has faced over the years is whether or not to get involved with what's happening over there in Syria. We have had no peace with Syria since 1973, the Yom Kippur War, but it has been a relatively quiet border. The only place that Israel has made a decision that it will get involved in what's happening across the border is if Israel is fired upon directly by what is happening over there and it lands here in Israel. We will respond to where those shots were fired. Two, if we see that there are troops and movement of ammunition and weapons making their way through Syria to Lebanon that could then be utilized by Hezbollah against Israel. And three, if Iran itself gets too close to the border, Israel will not allow that. And this is the challenge. At what point does Israel do something about what's happening on the other side of the border, or does Israel stay out? Now, this is only one puzzle piece in a much larger geopolitical reality in which Israel looks to all of its borders with concern. What is happening in Lebanon? What is happening in Egypt? What is happening in Jordan? Now, two of those countries, Israel actually has peace with. Well, this is the Middle East, and once one domino falls, who's to say where the rest will fall?
Now, as we look out on the view, and pretty soon we're going to leave Mount Bental where we are, one of the things that we should understand, we heard our guy talk about the fact that since 1973, we haven't had peace. And the truth is, even before that, we didn't have peace. We had the 6-Day War before that, and before that, we had 48 War. And when the 48 War of Independence was over, it was really just an armistice line. It was not a peace border because of a peace agreement that happened at the end of the war. So there is a very long history of animosity. And yet, from very early on in this grassroots rebellion turned civil war turned world war, Israel took it upon itself to accept not refugees, because that's a different can of worms as far as Israel is concerned. I mean, the concept is a can of worms, not, of course, the refugees themselves. As individuals, human beings are human beings. What Israel has taken upon itself, however, is any injured Syrian that's brought to our borders, Israel first took care of in special MASH units. These are mobile medical centers along the border. And when those were overrun, began taking in injured Syrian people into our hospitals in the north. And this is really quite phenomenal if you think about the fact that when each of these injured Syrians wakes up from whatever operation they might have gone through, in the room, in addition to a doctor and the nurse, you're also going to have an Arabic-speaking social worker there. Somebody on the team who speaks Arabic, so that when they open their eyes, they don't go into shock because of everything they've been taught about who Israelis are and what they would do to them. This too is happening. Obviously, it doesn't mean that everything's perfect, but this too is happening. And the other thing that I'll add is that while this clip was filmed back in towards the holidays around in 2020, so a little bit more than a year ago, we're seeing more and more intensity as far as Israel's responses to what's going on in Syria, primarily against Iranian establishment in Syria, both close to the border and even farther to the border. Because again, Iran has made it very clear, their goal is the annihilation of the state of Israel. And one of the things that Israel said early on, this is regardless of one's politics, if a country is going to tell you that it's going to destroy you, and it's trying to get the capability to do so, you better believe them. Now, should Israel invade Syria? We're not there yet, and hopefully we won't have to get there. But that's what's been going on in the north. There's been more reports, international reports, I'll say, that Israel has been conducting specific pinpoint attacks against Iranian infrastructure and military rockets, etc., especially when those rockets and those precision guiding material that would allow the 120, 130,000 rockets that Hezbollah has in Lebanon to become smart rockets and missiles, Israel can't allow that to happen. What we're going to do is we're going to actually you can see Mount Hermon here in the haze in the distance. We're going to fly away from the top of Mount Bental, and we're going to find ourselves hovering over one of the 4 Druze villages that are here in the Golan. And actually, we're going to go down and maybe take a little bit of a break because I'm getting a little hungry. I don't know about you. And we'll meet a friend of mine who lives in Masada and is a Druze gentleman. This, by the way, was filmed well before Corona, I'll just add.
So our day in the Golan Heights continues, and it's actually been a great day. We got a little bit hungry. We're in the Druze village of Masadeh. Here on the Golan Heights, in addition to the Jews who live on the Golan Heights, and there's about 24,000 Jews who live in the Golan Heights, there's also about 18,000 Druze who live on the Golan Heights. The Druze aren't Muslim, and they're not Christian, and they're not Jewish. They're their own religion and their own culture, and they're an integral part of Israeli society. First of all, the food is excellent. I have to say the falafel is the best I've ever had. The amount of Druze that live in Israel are about 200,000 Druze. Here on the Golan Heights, there are 4 Druze villages. The rest of the Druze live in other villages in the Galilee Mountains, which we saw earlier, and also in the Carmel Mountains, which are not far from the city of Haifa. You know what? Maybe what we could do is we can go ahead and ask the owner, who's a friend of mine, Khaled, to come and join us, and maybe he can answer a few questions. I'm actually going to ask Khaled the questions in Hebrew, and he's going to answer, and then I'll translate. אמרתי שאני אשאל אותך בעברית, אז ח'אלד, כמה זמן אתה גר פה בכפר, במסעדה?
42 שנה.
42. So, Khaled lives here 42 years already. Is that all your life? כל החיים שלך?
כן.
כן? והמשפחה שלך, כמה זמן הם במסעדה?
הם נולדו גם כאן.
So
אבא שלי ואמא שלי נולדו במסעדה.
So Khaled's father and mother were both born here in the village as well. וכמה זמן אתה פה עם המסעדה?
אני כבר זה 4 חודשים וחצי במסעדה.
4 חודשים פה?
כן, במסעדה למטה שהייתה לי המסעדה הראשונה, הייתי 23 שנה.
Okay, so this restaurant he's been for 4.5 months now, but there was another restaurant that the family had that he had for 23 years. Who would you say comes to the restaurant? מי מגיע למסעדה? איזה סוגי אנשים? אנחנו רואים פה כל מיני סוגי אנשים.
בעיקרון יהיה ישראלים, ובנוסף לזה גם כאילו דרוזים, ערבים וגם תיירים מחוץ לארץ.
So Khaled is saying that there's all kinds of clientele that come here. There's Jewish Israelis, there's Arab Israelis, there's Druze, of course, it's a Druze village, and there's tourists that come from overseas who come here. So, all right, I'm going to let him go. So, תודה Khaled, תודה רבה.
So anyway, it really is a great restaurant. I have to say, it's called El Sultan. Now, as we hover high above, we'll have another bird's eye view before we make our way to our final stop. I will tell you that the Druze are sometimes mistaken as being just an offshoot of Islam or another branch of Islam, and it's not. 1,000 years ago, and I'm speaking as an outsider looking into somebody else's religion, there were those within the community, the Muslim community of Egypt, that realized that it was in fact not Muhammad who was the last true prophet of God, but rather the true prophet of God was Jethro, the father-in-law of Moses. And because there was a shift in their own understanding of self and their own faith, they were persecuted by the Muslims in Egypt and had to run for their lives. And for a short amount of time, the religion stayed open. People could convert into it, but then they closed the ranks. They circled the wagons, and nobody else was allowed to convert into becoming Druze, and nobody could convert out. And if you married someone out of the Druze society, you were cut off and no longer Druze. If you speak to the Druze themselves, they'll tell you that Druze had always been with the creation of the world and laid dormant until the God in heavens felt it was time for them to emerge. What is interesting, I think, about the Druze, it's actually a secret religion. There are secular Druze and there are religious Druze, and there's no tension amongst them that one should be like the other, unlike some other religions you might be familiar with. In addition, those secular Druze aren't shared the secrets of the religion. Only the religious Druze know. And therefore, for them, being Druze, which is both singular and plural, is as much about the culture as it is about the faith and the religion. Also, not dissimilar to some other religions you might know. And what we do know about the Druze are a couple of things. One is they have no nationalistic aspirations. They're not looking to create a country of their own. And therefore, while they spread throughout the Middle East, the Druze that live in Lebanon are loyal to the state of Lebanon, the country of Lebanon, and to Syria. And here in Israel, they are loyal to the state of Israel. They also, this is what is known, believe in reincarnation. Not like that they would come back as an inanimate object, as some other faiths perhaps in the East might believe, but that there's a finite amount of Druze souls in the universe, and Druze males will come back as males and Druze females as females. In fact, there are stories amongst the Druze that a Druze child growing up in let's say the village of Masadeh can know things about Daliat el Carmel village and a particular household and the people who live there because in a previous life they were family. Now I will say that the Druze men, unlike general Arab population in Israel, have mandatory conscription into the IDF. They took mandatory conscription upon themselves shortly after the founding of the State of Israel. And the men, in fact, served like Israeli Jews serve. Now, I'll say not all Druze serve and not all Jews serve in the IDF, but there is that mandatory conscription. The Druze in the Golan actually are in a unique spot, almost literally between a rock and a hard place. That rock would be basalt rock for sure. And the reason for that is because this arbitrary border that was created because of the battles in the area did not distinguish where the different family members are living. And Khalid actually has family in Syria. And the fear is that if they're too openly loyal to the state of Israel, terrible things will happen to their family members in Syria. And as we've learned, both Assad Sr. and Bashar al-Assad Jr. have no problem slaughtering their own people. Many of the Druze in the Golan Heights, in those 4 villages, they were all offered citizenship post-67. Most took on permanent residency, although there are also bona fide citizens, and you can see Israeli flags as you drive through the village, but it is a unique situation which is different than the other Druze who live in Haifa or in the Carmel Mountains or in the Galilee. But what I would like to do is to actually zoom not far from here, just down the slopes of the Golan for our last stop of today's journey. And we're going to find ourselves in the parking area of what once was a Syrian military outpost up until the year 1967. And we're going to carefully get off of the bus and we're going to make our way down this trail. This half-track that you can see here, by the way, is an Israeli half-track that was involved in the battles that unfolded here during the Six-Day War. Now, as we make our way down the path, you may see, can you see this yellow sign over here with the orange triangle? Can anybody see that? Hopefully it's clear enough. And that is a sign internationally recognized, and it also says it in Hebrew and English and in Arabic, that beware, there are minefields on the other side. And therefore, if anybody needs the restroom, please do not wander off and just let me know and I'll tell you which tree you can go behind, but I don't want anybody wandering unfortunately into any minefield. So what we're going to do is we'll make our way now down the path and we'll hear the story that unfolded here at what is called Tel Facher. It's also known as the Golani Overview. And the reason it's called the Golani Overview, and also the reason that it's also been turned into a memorial to the Golani Brigade, which is one of our premier infantry brigades in the IDF, is because they were part of the units that battled here on the last couple of days of the Six-Day War.
So we're standing in the northern part of the Golan Heights right now, about 2/3 of the way up the slopes to the top of the plateau. The incredible view behind me is hopefully seen clearly in the screen, but you can see the hula, you can even see the kibbutzim and the fish ponds, you can see the agricultural fields, and you can even see the southern part of Lebanon just to our north, the Hula Valley. You can also see the northern reaches of what we call the finger of the Galilee and the Galilee Mountains. There is so much to do in the Golan Heights. You can see incredible waterfalls and swimming holes and go on incredible hikes. And you can see dormant volcanoes and archaeological evidence of Jewish existence here 1,500, if not 2,000 years ago. Not to mention, you can meet really wonderful people. And yet the Golan Heights is more than all of that. In 1967, Israel endured what would be known as the Six-Day War. The Six-Day War begins on June 5th, 1967. On June 5th, 1967, Israel starts the Six-Day War, and of course, Israel doesn't start the Six-Day months, weeks, not to mention years of terror and animosity of our neighbors against Israel. We have seen Egyptian troops move into the Sinai Peninsula. We've seen ongoing bombardment from the Golan Heights down to the Hula Valley for years. We've seen actual threats. We will destroy you, Israel. It leads Israel to go ahead and to conduct a preemptive strike. It should have been called the One-Day War. Why? Because in one day, the Sinai Peninsula was in our hands. It then should have been called the 2.5-day war, maybe 3-day war, because Israel tells Jordan, we're not interested right now in the old city of Jerusalem or the West Bank. Don't get involved. We won't get involved. Jordan, King Hussein bombards Israel. Well, at the end of those 3.5 days, the Temple Mount is in our hands, as the famous statement was made. And then it should have been over, and yet it wasn't. And it wasn't because the kibbutzim and the moshavim and the city of Kiryat Shmona, which we can see in the distance, essentially tell the government. Levi Eshkol was the prime minister back then, Yitzhak Rabin, who was the chief of staff, the head of the military, and Moshe Dayan, who was the minister of defense. If you don't do something about the Syrians, we're out of here. We're not raising our children in bomb shelters anymore. We're not going out into the field with armed, protected tractors, not knowing if we're going to return. And ultimately, the government makes the decision that this is the historic moment to once and for all push the Syrians back and stop the threat. The lush green fields and the fish ponds that you see below, that's where our troops begin to get organized, and the decision is made that in this particular area, the Golani Brigade, assisted by the Armored Corps and the Combat Engineering Corps, would take the site that we're on right now. This site is known as Tel Facher. It's a Syrian military outpost that essentially had about 19 years to dig in. And as you can see, had a bird's eye view of the settlements, the kibbutzim, moshavim, agricultural fields down in the valley. The decision to take this particular site so that the Armored Corps could make their way up to the plateau of the Golan and push the Syrians back. Now, not being Hollywood, the best laid plans did not ultimately come to fruition. And at the last moment, instead of circumventing the site and coming and attacking from behind, the Golani forces realized that they had to charge up the side of the hill dead on. You can see it's a very difficult site to take. You don't have to be a military person to know the advantage the Syrians had standing up here, anybody trying to ascend. This is not the mines place, not to worry. Let's say I was fortunate enough to make my way up those first fields, and I somehow got through the minefields and was able to push forward beyond the barbed wire fences and the other minefields, and then was able to get to this line just down below and past these trees, and I still had to get to the main bunker, which is just behind you. Imagine if you were standing here at Tel Facher, how easy it would be for you to toss a pebble out to hit me, not to mention a bullet, as I'm trying to make my way up the hill in battle. Not that difficult, and yet they did. This battle took about 3.5 hours at 6:22 p.m. on the 5th day of the 6-day war. Tel Facher was in Israeli hands. Sadly, there were 34 Israeli commanders and soldiers who were killed. 100 soldiers were wounded. I wasn't even a good idea in 1967. I've had my own experiences. I can tell you that what was driving these soldiers, well, there were a few things. Because other countries have had their hills, whether in Iwo Jima, in Vietnam, Afghanistan, or Iraq, and those soldiers charge up their hills because of their buddies, shoulder to shoulder. So there was that. But there was also something else, and that was knowing that, in fact, there was no one else between the enemy and their home. And if their home wasn't in the kibbutz down below in the valley, it was in Tiberias, and if not Tiberias, in Haifa or Tel Aviv or Jerusalem or Beersheba or anywhere in between. And there is real power knowing that you are the last line of defense. This is a powerful place to stop, and it's an incredible memorial. It is part of the experience when you travel through the Golan Heights, when you travel through Israel. It doesn't define us. It is, however, part of who we are.
So what's so interesting, I think, is that, being at a site like that at Tel Facher, and as I mentioned, I wasn't even a good idea in 1967, but with my own experiences and being able to literally be in various places and look over my shoulder and see the lights of Israel behind me, that is quite a motivator, knowing you are the last line of defense or even the first line of defense. But what the powerful part is not that. It's having conversations with my daughters, both my oldest, who just got out of the army. She was in a combat unit in the Iron Dome unit, and my middle daughter is about to go into the same unit. These are frontline units. And that they understand that as well already. But what connects all of the dots for me is that none of us want to be there. We'd rather be doing something else. This was true 30 years ago, and it was definitely true for my oldest, and it's true for my youngest, my middle daughter, even though they've made a choice to be in that space because of what's so important. And that, of course, is to defend. And the defense of this country is regardless of the little note we put in the ballot when we vote. We could vote on the far left, we could vote on the far right, and we all have young people in our lives who are the ones looking over their shoulder, looking at the lights behind them, knowing that this is a place that's important enough to defend. Now, let's just be clear. We are much more than just our wars and just our military. In fact, we are much more about living in the land of Israel, in the state of Israel, and making it a better place than we are, God forbid, about dying for the state of Israel. The reason I stopped there, however, as you heard our guide say, it doesn't define us, but it's part of who we are just as much as the beautiful landscape of the Golan is. Why did we go to the Gila Boone River? Because that too is part of who we are. That too is part of the state of Israel and the land of Israel, just as is the story of Eitan Bloomberg. And the challenges, the world has had challenges. What's so unique is that in times of stress and war that we've had here, sometimes we have solidarity trips that come over and we guide around. It's very powerful during those times when the rockets are falling. This time around with COVID, the whole world deserves a solidarity trip because we're all going through the same thing. But a window into the world of Eitan, or a window into, we met last week, we met Lydia, is to have a hand on the pulse and to try and bring you just a little bit closer to be able to reconnect with a place that obviously means a lot to you as it does to me. So we covered a lot of ground today. As always, really got a sense of what the Golan was about. And are there any questions? Feel free to just unmute yourself and we can just take it from each other if you would like. if you have any questions or comments. Which you don't have to have, that's okay as well. I will let you know that next week is going to be a little bit different, because if last week we were following in the footsteps of the early Zionists as the foundation to the modern state of Israel that would be created here, and today we went back and forth between modern state and some antiquity and really touched on a very vibrant part of who we are today, next week we're just going back. We're going back 2,000 years to the Second Temple period. And we will be traveling to the country through that lens. Mostly the end of the Second Temple period. However, we will ask the question, as we should ask anytime we travel throughout Israel, but specifically next week. Meaning, why are these lessons from the Second Temple period relevant to my life today? Or rather, I should say, are they relevant? Is there any connection between what was and what is today, whether I live in the land or I don't? But all of that we will ask next week. So, as always, if you have any questions, you have my email, I believe, on one of the emails there, but I'm always happy to continue the conversation. And if there are no questions or comments, I will see you all next week. I hope you have a wonderful rest of the week and a wonderful Shabbat, and be well and be healthy.
Thank you, Eric.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
It was excellent.
Very welcome. Thank you. And thank you, Paulette, for being behind the scenes there. All right. Litrot lekulam. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.